This is the box that I'll be replacing today in this video. I made this over a year and a half ago for my wife to store all her tea in, and at the time I was buying all my hardwoods from the big box store, so I was limited to red oak. And I made the great decision on top of that to stain it with black cherry stain. I used rabbet joints on the corners, a spray lacquer substitute, and as you could tell by the lid, it was not even square when I was done because I didn't know what that meant at the time. So hopefully in a year and a half, while I'm no master woodworker yet, I think I've come a long way, and I'm going to try to give this another shot, make her a newer tea box that doesn't weigh 150 pounds, and hopefully looks a little bit better and is a little bit better made. So follow along and see how it turns out. I started off by selecting a few pieces of 3/4 black walnut, which I certainly had not pre-staged at the top of this pile before I started recording. And then I moved over to my other storage shelf and found a couple pieces of 1/4 inch walnut I had on hand from quite a while ago that I was going to use for the dividers inside. Took it over to the miter saw and cross-cut it down to usable lengths, but not the final dimensions, because I want to get nice square cuts on my table saw with my cross-cut sled to get the final length of the pieces. I took those pieces over to the table saw and set my height of my blade, and then adjusted my fence to the correct width, and then I started ripping those down and getting one straight edge on all of them. After ripping my 4 sides to the correct width, I swapped out my ripping blade for my cross-cut blade, and then got my sled out for cross-cutting those pieces to their final length. After I cut one end of each piece perfectly square, I set up a stop block so that the front and back sides are exactly the same length, and each of the left and right sides are exactly the same length as well. That way I can ensure that I get a perfectly square box at the final product. Once my 4 pieces are cut to final length, I lay out the 4 sides in the way that I want them, and then I put an A, B, C, and D on each corner on both pieces that are making up that corner, so that I know after I cut all the box joints how they're going to situate themselves against each other, because they have to go together a specific way because of how the box joints will be laid out. Now back to the table saw with my dado stack installed and my box joint jig in the miter slots. Started cutting the box joints and realized that I had played with that finger that keeps your workpiece right where it needs to be for the next cut, so I had to do some readjustment on that. I had been messing with it before I did this build after I had built the jig, not realizing that it was no longer where it should have been, so I had to make some minor adjustments there. It's especially important at this point to take your time going from one piece to the next to make sure that you're lining up the next piece correctly. The finger joints aren't the same on both ends of every piece, or they won't line up, so I take a little bit extra time that I cut out in between each cut going on to the next piece to make sure that I am cutting it in the correct direction and it's facing the right way. Just make sure everything goes together okay in the end. Save myself some headache down the road. Now that my joints are cut, I take all 4 pieces, take a look at the sides, looking for those letters I'd put on before and laying them out how they're supposed to be. I want to make sure everything fits up nice while it's dry before I get any glue involved, and also I want to get some measurements to get the bottom panel that I'll be laying into the walnut to comprise the bottom of the box measured out, so that I'm cutting that to the right size as well. So make sure everything's square, making sure it's sitting nice, it's tight but not too tight, and I'm pretty happy with how it turned out. So I go back to the table saw with a piece of 1/4 inch ply, reset my height, get that dado stack back out and go back to my combination blade, and I cut that piece of 1/4 inch ply down to the correct size so that it's ready to go into the bottom of the box. With my bottom panel cut, it's on to putting the groove in the bottom edge of all of those 4 side panels so that that bottom panel can slide in and sit properly and securely. So I adjust my blade height. This is important because I cut that panel to a specific size, so I need to make sure that my depth of these cuts is correct, or the panel will be loose in the bottom or not fit at all. So this is the point I decide where I want that cut to go in the board. You'll notice with the front and back panels, I'm cutting it into the finger itself so that there's going to be a small gap in my corners on both the left and right side that I'll fill later. But I wanted that to be on the side, not on the face of the box that you're going to see all the time. There's a lot of different ways to make that groove. This is the way I chose. It's kind of the quickest and easiest in my opinion, but there are multiple different ways. I could have done a drop cut onto the blade, which is a lot more dangerous, but this seemed like the safer, easiest move, so that's what I went with. Now the kerf of the blade I'm using is a 1/8 inch, and I'm inlaying a 1/4 inch panel, so I need to run each board through more than once. So I move my fence over a little bit, and I'm making a second pass with each board, grabbing that piece of plywood and then test fitting it. I could have done a full 1/8 inch over, but I want to slowly ease it into where I want it to be because, again, I don't want it to be too loose because I can't put wood back on. I can only take more off down the road. So started off pretty snug, adjusted my fence a little bit, test fit again, and just looking to get that perfect fit. And there it is. So now I know that's where it's going to be, so I run the other 3 pieces through. With my groove cut and my bottom panel cut, it's time to do another dry fit. So that was the test piece I was using over the table saw, just a smaller cut off, and there's the bottom panel that I had already cut to be able to use for the base. So now I'm squeezing everything on, and like I said, I got a nice firm fit on that bottom panel, so I'm just slowly easing everything together. I don't want to chip out the facing on that plywood or damage any of the joints. I actually ended up, you can kind of see a gap there on that bottom. I went back and recut a bottom panel because it just wasn't quite fitting it how I wanted it to. So I went a little bit bigger because my grooves were deeper than I probably should have done the first time. Luckily I have enough 1/4 inch plywood laying around, and I have another use for that piece down the road, even though it's a little bit too small for this job. So I had already measured out a bag of tea, so now I'm marking where I want my dividers to go on the front and back walls of the box. And now it's time to swap back out for my dado stack so I can cut grooves so that I can have some loose walnut dividers, those last pieces I grabbed at the beginning of the video, to be able to slide down in. And they'll be adjustable, so if she wants to take one out and have a wider space for maybe a box of tea or something like that down the road, she has that option. But so they'll lay in there loosely, but they'll be cut wide enough that those 1/4 inch panels go in. So I went to a 1/4 inch dado stack, and again I'm using a stock block to ensure that both on the front and back panels the dividers are going to lay square within the box. In order to get the exact fit I was looking for, I did end up starting a little bit small, and then I had to swap out how my dado stack was set up. So I changed out some parts and then went back, took a chipper out, went back. Unfortunately, one of the grooves is going to be a little bit wider, but it's going to be okay in the long run. So I grabbed a piece of cherry, ran it through, test fit it, just to make sure I was getting the fit I wanted on the other dividers. And then back, resetting the stop blocks to recut those first 2 to make sure everything's uniform in the end. At this stage I didn't want to do all my sanding, but I did want to get all the interior panels and stuff that would be hard to sand once everything was assembled up to 220 grit so that it was ready to go, because I wasn't going to want to get back in there by hand trying to get in all those corners. And then it was onto the glue up after all my interior sides were nice and smooth. So I rub glue in all my finger joints. This is always the stressful part, making sure you get everything glued up in a timely manner so nothing's drying on you. Because glued box joints are pretty strong, I didn't feel the need to use too many clamps, so I put one clamp lengthwise just to keep nice pressure going that way. And then I checked for square on 2 of the corners as I go, because as you're clamping things down, you never know when something might slip out of square just a little bit. And then I used 2 clamps going this way, just because the box is a little bit longer that direction, so I kind of spaced them out a little bit, got them a little bit closer to the joints themselves. And I didn't want to put too much pressure because I don't want to bow the wood as it's being glued. But I wanted to make sure it's nice and snug, and then grab my square again to make sure, again, everything's staying square. Kept a rag handy to wipe off all that excess glue. Luckily I didn't get too much squeeze out on the inside, but I was able to get that out of there in time before it dried. While I waited for the glue to dry, I went and grabbed some more walnut, headed over to the miter saw and cut it to a rough length, and then ripped the 3 panels to the final width that I wanted for my lid. And then swapped out my blade and added my crosscut sled back on so I could get one end square and then be able to cut those 3 pieces down to their final length for the lid as well. I set the box aside while it continued to dry and grabbed 2 pipe clamps so I could glue up the panel for the lid itself. I used a little bit of this green tape to make sure I don't get any staining on the walnut, because I find that these black pipe clamps always leave stains on the walnut if they're in direct contact with each other. So I make sure they're set to the right length, add glue, spread it around, and then get ready to get that panel all lined up and square and glued up nicely. I used 1 set of cauls in the middle just to make sure I had good alignment. I could have used 3, but I know this panel is narrow enough that I could go through my planer, so I'm not too worried about that. And while I'm waiting for that to dry, now the box is ready to come out of clamps, and I can check on that. My joints themselves weren't absolutely perfect. I talked about that in the build video for my box joint jig, which there'll be a link for at the end of this video. I got a little bit of tear out. I wasn't too worried about it on this project. I had plenty of walnut filler, which isn't the best solution, but I knew it would work for this. And again, it's just for our house, so it's something I kind of wanted to play around with a little bit and see how it would work on the walnut and make sure it wasn't just the ash that I was having the problem with. So I started rubbing walnut filler in there just to close up a little bit of the gaps that are visible. While I waited for the filler to dry, I grabbed the pieces of 1/4-inch walnut that I had grabbed earlier and got those cut down to the final length that they're going to be as the dividers within the T-box. So I set up the stop block again and got them cut down to the right width. You can see I made those gaps a little bit wide like I said before, so they slide right in and out. Once those were ready, the filler was dry and ready as well, so I started off sanding at 150, moving up to 220 as the final on the outside of the box, and it smoothed down pretty nice. You'll see that at the end. And then the lid was ready to come out of the clamps and get a final look at that and see how that glue up turned out. After I got that little bit of squeeze up out and let it dry a little bit longer, it was over to the planer to get any of the glue squeeze out that I couldn't get off with the rag off, and then make sure those panels are perfectly lined up with each other, and that is a much better look than it was when it came out of the clamps. Now it's time to sand. I had just a little bit of planer snipe. I always kind of deal with that. It comes off with sandpaper, it takes a little bit more time, not a big deal. And again, I'm starting this with 150 grit and going up to 220. Usually I have a little bit more of a plan, but I kind of went into this, again, it's a project for our house, so I went into it kind of open-minded with how I wanted the lid to look. And I decided to put a little handle on the front to be able to lift it up easier, because it is just going to sit right on top of the box instead of being inset into the box or anything fancy like that. So I took another cut off of walnut, I jointed one side of it, and then did a half circle with a can of stain I had laying around, took it over to the sander and got right up to that line, nice and smooth. And off camera I had added some custom laser engraving to the top as well that I thought would look nice. So I sanded down that handle because I knew once I got it glued onto the front it would be very difficult to sand anymore with that concave angle on either end of it. So I got all the sander marks off with a little bit of finer grit, added some glue. I'm going to use some wood glue in the middle and a little bit of CA glue on either end with some accelerator on the rest of the lid, just so I can get a quicker fit, because I don't want to clamp this on there and have it wiggle around at all. I'm going to put it in place, kind of squeeze it a little bit for a couple seconds, and that should be plenty to hold it on. So I hit the lid itself with the accelerator, use the CA glue on the handle, and I had just enough setup time to get it right where I wanted it before that CA glue was fully set up and dried. And then I just wiped off the squeezed out wood glue. And it's going to look a lot better with stain, but I sanded it down. I made sure it was a little bit proud when I started, and then I sanded it down flush in the end. With the lid complete, I laid out where I wanted my hinge to be, measured for the center of the box, and used some painter's tape just to kind of hold that in place while I drew the dots in the screw holes where I wanted those holes to be, so I could drill them out so I wouldn't have any splitting. So I laid it out, and I remembered I should probably measure and figure out exactly where the center is. So I measured that out and then moved it over a little bit. At this point I was ready for finish. I like to use Watco Danish oil. Not an ad for them, but I'm really happy with how it goes on. Danish oil just gives a natural feel to the wood. It doesn't, cake it up or give it a plasticky feel like polyurethanes or lacquers or other furniture finishes you see used a lot are. It gives a very natural feel to the wood still, but gives it a little bit of protection still without feeling cheap. So I use that on a lot of my finished products. I'm using it here as well. It's satisfying to see finish go on any kind of wood, but walnut in particular really seems to come to life once you get whatever finish you're using on there. And again, Danish oil just really seems to make the grain pop. So this piece of wood that I used for the sides really looked a lot better after I got the finish on than I thought it would. You could see that rippling effect on the corner closest to the camera. I was really impressed by that, and I'm glad I used that for the lid, even though it's going to be on the underside when I'm done. Now that the finish is dry, go ahead and find those marks and drill out all the holes for my one and only piece of hardware I'm using on this project, that hinge in the back. While brass color isn't my favorite, I had an extra one in the shop, so again, since it's something for us, I decided not to run out and get, brushed nickel or something else and just use what I had available. Overall, I'm really satisfied with how this project turned out. I know there's a lot more I can learn, a lot to improve on, but I think I've come a long way from the first T-box I built, the one this is replacing. The final product has, fewer gaps and seams. I did have tear out on those box joints. That's something I can improve in the future, but overall, I'm pretty happy with how it looks, and my wife really seems to like it as well. If you want to see some more pictures of it, there's a few on my Instagram, @FernwoodFarmsWoodworking. Please feel free to go over there and give me a follow and see what else I'm up to between videos. Please subscribe, leave a comment below with what you think, what you would have done different, any other tips and tricks you know. All the tools I used are linked in the description below, so feel free to check those out if there's anything you're interested in using for yourself. If you enjoyed the video, please subscribe to the channel if you're not already, and please share this with someone else who you think might enjoy the video as well. And if you absolutely hated the video, send it to someone you really don't like. Thank you.